You are watching an episode in our Landlording A to Z series, where we walk you through the steps, skills, and challenges involved with residential rental real estate investing. We share our expert advice, including the tips, tricks, and strategies we've learned over years of managing rental property. Please subscribe to our channel to get notified each time a new episode comes out, and please like and share our content with people you know who might be interested. Thanks for watching.
Hello, you have Chris and Eli here from Landlord Gurus. Today we are coming to you with episode number 15 of our Landlording A to Z series, where we have started all the way at the beginning and talked through each step of becoming, and including deciding whether or not it's a good decision for you to buy a rental property, through getting the property ready, finding your tenants. In our last episode, we covered the best ways to collect rent. And today we're going to talk about evictions. So first off, I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that evictions are a bad situation for everybody. The vast majority of tenants are reasonable people and want to pay their rent. This is their housing, and people do not want instability where it comes to their housing, and generally want to do the right thing. So most issues can be worked out amicably, even when trouble does come up. So keep that in mind and always try to work through things amicably. Eviction should really be a last resort. Unfortunately, however, there are some times when a tenant can't or won't meet the terms of their lease agreement, and that can be any kind of the terms of the lease that could lead to an issue where eviction is necessary. Non-payment isn't the only serious problem that can come up. Others can include there being damage to the property, dangerous conditions, illegal activity, or conflict with other neighbors. And while non-payment is the most common reason for eviction, there are other issues that can get you there as well. And in these cases, forcing a tenant to leave through eviction can become the tenant's last and only resort to fix a really broken situation. So today we're going to talk about what an eviction is, when it should be used, alternative solutions, and some tips for best practices, both for conducting your relationship with your tenants as well as executing an eviction if one is necessary. So please like, subscribe, and share our channel. If you subscribe, you'll get a notification each time one of these episodes comes out. Chris, do you remember what our next one is?
I think we'll be going through the move-out process.
Move-out process, right. And if you subscribe, you'll get notified each time we drop one of these. So Chris is going to take us through what is an eviction.
Yeah, right. Thanks, Eli. And I'd also add in right about now that we are not attorneys ourselves. We're not real estate attorneys. So we're going to offer some high-level advice, some information, but when in doubt, we do advise you to contact an attorney.
Yeah.
Especially with eviction. It can, and we'll go through some of it, but it can get complicated, and sometimes there are certain procedures and steps that you got to go through. So.
Right, and penalties if you don't do it right.
So what is an eviction? I'll start with that. An eviction is a court-ordered removal of a tenant. Like Eli just said, common reasons for eviction include tenant's failure to pay rent, damage to the property, dangerous conditions in or around the property, or dangerous behavior, criminal activity, keeping unauthorized animals, or it could be just any other violation of other terms of the lease. Your lease will dictate what is allowed and what is not allowed. So, they're there for a reason, and if those get violated, they can be cause for eviction. Eviction is also sometimes known as an unlawful retainer case, so you might see that as well. So when you bring up an eviction, if the judgment is cited for the landlord, the judge will issue what's called a writ of restitution or a writ of possession. And that's basically legal notice to the tenant that they must leave the property. And if the tenant refuses to leave, then a sheriff is dispatched to execute the writ and potentially forcibly removing the tenant from the property if necessary. And it's a note here, and it's a good thing to remember at any point, an eviction process can come to an end if the tenant fixes the problem. Maybe they pay rent, whatever it is, or they abide by the terms of the lease, or if they decide to vacate the property voluntarily.
Right. Yeah, but just because you head off down a road towards an eviction, which really is any time you serve a notice, that doesn't mean it has to end there. So yeah, I'll take it from there. I'm going to go through kind of the anatomy of an eviction, the steps and stages. And this is how an eviction generally unfolds. So one, there's this problem, non-payment or other violation of lease terms. The situation is broken. Two, first thing to do is to issue a notice to your tenant notifying them that they're in violation of the lease and giving them a window of opportunity. And this is usually predetermined by local laws, what that window for these causes are. Again, something, a lawyer would be useful. They'll know what those windows are, giving the tenant the opportunity to fix the problem. So the most common notices are notice to pay or vacate. Obviously, this is when somebody hasn't paid. So that tells your tenant, you need to pay the money that's overdue. Or if you don't, at the end of this window, then you need to move out. So here in Seattle, that window is 14 days. They have 14 days from the date of that notice to remedy the situation, or they should move out, or you go on to the next step.
And then the way that those days are calculated, there is a certain process by which they calculate those days. It's like the day that the notice is served technically is day 0. And so day 1 is not until the following day.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, those types of technicalities may seem minor, but they are very important. And, again, an attorney can advise you on that. Exactly.
Or rental housing associations. Most states and larger cities have rental housing associations, so they're often a good place to go for resources.
And there are certain prescribed methods for how notices can be served as well. That's something to keep in mind. You can't just send off an email or tell them that this is what's happening.
Yeah, no. Generally, this is actually delivering it to the hand of the tenant or some other suitable. The language gets kind of. Essentially, it's another adult who's there at the premises when it's delivered. But at least here in Seattle, and I think most places, it has to be delivered in person. Emailing might work, but it's not foolproof, and it could be meaningless if you get called on it. So the second type of notice is a notice to comply. So tenant has a period of time, 10 days being common, to fix a way in which they're in violation of the terms of their lease. So examples of this could be having unauthorized animals, or having done some damage that they need to fix within this window, or smoking. They need to not smoke anymore if it's a non-smoking property. And then the third type of notice is a notice to quit. And this is generally used when the situation is deemed non-curable. So this is a problem that they've broken the lease. There is no fixing it. So this is commonly where there's been some kind of criminal activity, menacing or harassing behavior towards others, dangerous materials on site, or dangerous condition. And this is generally short duration. It's 3 days here in Seattle. So this notice says you need to leave and you have 3 days. And that's just a window of time to leave in. There is no remedying of the situation in this case. So the next step, if you've served these notices and the tenant hasn't acted appropriately, they haven't fixed the problem, or in the case of the notice to quit, they haven't left after that 3-day period, then you file an eviction lawsuit. So you go to the local courts. Here it's a superior court, whatever court is charged with handling evictions, and you file a complaint. There'll be some fees. Generally, they're not a huge amount of money, but up to a couple $100 possibly. At that point, the next step is to serve the complaint and the summons on the tenant. So that means that you are letting the tenant know that an eviction case has been opened against them. This is delivering the court documents showing that the landlord is pursuing eviction, and it communicates to the tenant when a court hearing will be held where the landlord will be presenting their case. The tenant needs to get this notice and summons to come to the hearing at least 2 days prior to the hearing. It seems to me like it'd be wise to give them as much notice as possible so that they're likely to show up and keep the ball rolling. Although I guess if they don't show up, the court will generally automatically go with the landlord and grant an eviction. So maybe that's not the case. You do want to give people a fair amount of time, and it should not be delivered by the landlord. I think there are lots of just common sense reasons not to do this. It could be a volatile situation. There are services that you can hire. A local real estate lawyer would know who to hire, and I'm sure just a search could get you somebody to do that as well. So, that gets you through telling the tenants, giving them the notice that this is going on. So there will be a period of time that the tenant has to reply to the complaint. And here in Washington, it's up to 30 days. So that window must be that the tenant has the time to respond given the notice, and they're told when this hearing is scheduled. And at that point, if they show, then the court hears the two sides. And if they don't, then I think the default is for the landlord. And if at this hearing, the court rules in favor of the landlord granting an eviction, they'll receive what Chris mentioned, the writ of restitution, or writ of possession. This tells the tenant, you need to leave. The court has deemed that you have broken the lease and that you need to leave. And if they don't voluntarily do that, then the next step is that a sheriff's deputy will be dispatched out to execute the writ, which is compelling the tenant to leave. Often it's knocking on the door saying, you got to go. And I think in some cases they'll physically have to arrest people. So those are kind of the steps. And sorry for the clunkiness in there a little bit. Not something, thankfully, I go through all the time. But those are the kind of the steps in the timeline of an eviction process.
Exactly. And like we mentioned earlier, we might not often get all the way through the process, right? You might get a certain point and then they decide, and the tenant then is able to come up with the money or is able to fix whatever defect that has been going on. And so, yeah, I mean, again, like you never really want to get this far. Ideally, it doesn't get this far, but yeah, it can. So what information and documentation do you need to file an eviction case? So generally, you just need to have as much documentation as possible. We talk about this all the time, and property management software can help, that you want to have everything documented, whether it's failure to pay rent, whether it's sending out the proper notices, but you're going to want to have payment records and bank statements, maybe the last time they paid, or if you've got invoices where they didn't pay. Any communications you have had between you and the tenant. With software, you can have that kind of in a message thread. Any witnesses, if there's something that's been going on, maybe that's another tenant that's documented what's been going on as well. Any photos and video that you might have of that, and then in worst case scenario, any police reports that you might have if anything illegal has been going on your property. So it's all stuff that you want to have documented and keep that with you and bring it to court if you need to.
It'll be case specific, but generally just having everything in written form and being able to, this is just what goes into demonstrating your case to the judge. So we thought we should cover some best practices, both for avoiding evictions, but also kind of being prepared in case you get down the road to that. So first off, and we talk about this all the time, is to choose your tenants wisely, screen methodically, get an application with all of the relevant information, check references, look at screening reports for credit and criminal background history, and whether or not there's any history of evictions. So be careful and thorough when you're choosing your tenants. That might be the most important part of managing rental property that can't be enforced too heavily. And speaking of enforcement, enforce your lease terms consistently and promptly. So people run into issues, and I will often say, if somebody's late on rent, I will say, okay, I know things happen, and I'm not going to charge you the late fee that this one time, but that's your freebie. And then subsequently, you want to charge that late fee and issue the notice to pay or vacate promptly on the fourth day, when that whatever grace period you have between the day the rent is due and when the grace period is over, you serve that notice. So that you don't let issues become a pattern. I don't think you have to be absolutely militant about things to hold boundaries. You just have to make sure you don't let the boundaries start sliding. Keep good communication records, as Chris was just talking about. Either email thread or these messaging feature functions in the property management software apps are great because everything's right there with all the tenants, and their payment history is right there. Everything lives right there. Keep good payment records, whether that's your bank statements or rent ledger on the property management software. Just make sure everything's documented. This is a good reason not to take cash payments, as there's no paper trail. And you can get into kind of he said, she said, well, I gave him cash. And, really, if you do, you need to issue a receipt. But it's just not great practice in my mind. And even the person-to-person payment apps like PayPal or Venmo, they may be too subjective. So property management software is meant just for managing rental property, and it's a great way to take your payments and have everything documented right there. Always go to the property with the sheriff's deputy when they execute the writ of restitution, which returns the property to you. Often the sheriff's deputy cannot or won't compel the tenant to leave if you're not there or a manager isn't there. So make sure you go along. Be prepared with yourself or somebody being set up to move all the belongings out if the tenants don't take their belongings with them. Having tenants' properties left on site is a recipe for trouble. And they can come back and say, oh, I need to get in and get, you don't want that. Once that door closes, you don't want it to open again.
There's also certain rules about how their stuff is stored.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't just keep it or throw it away or whatever. You might have to store it for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, generally you're bound, and theoretically, I think you're due any storage fees if you can get them, but you don't want to get yourself in trouble by pitching their belongings and being liable for it. So, and lastly on this list is to be prepared to change the locks right there on the spot so that that outgoing tenant no longer has a way to get into that property. So,
yeah. And then sort of on the other side of the coin, things that you should never do during an eviction. So never threaten tenants with any kind of retaliation. Never, like, while they're there, don't change the locks on them while they're gone. Don't turn off the utilities so that they have no heat or no light or whatever. Those things are called self-help evictions, and where you're sort of forcing the tenants out by your behavior or by certain actions that make it impossible for them to live there. Even if they haven't paid rent, even if they're behind on their bills, you can't do it. It's illegal, and it can carry heavy fines. And it's definitely not worth it. So there are alternatives to eviction. Again, we talked about trying to avoid eviction if at all possible. So if you can come to an agreement, and it's like Eli said before, you don't want to go down a slippery slope, but in a lot of cases, it may be your best resort as opposed to an eviction where you set up a payment schedule or you give them a little bit of extra time to get certain things cleaned out, or get their pets somewhere else if that's one of the violations. Whatever it is, see if you can come to a mutual agreement, and and something where the tenant sort of voluntarily agrees to it. But if they're sort of coerced into something, or that they're not going to be able to do it, even if you come to an agreement, they're not going to follow through. So it's got to be something that you feel like they can actually commit to and they can actually fulfill. Otherwise, you just end up delaying this process more and more and more. Another alternative is something called cash for keys, which we've talked about before, and we've written about this before, where if a tenant, say, is behind on their rent, maybe the easiest thing is, or even if it's a different lease violation, it might be the easiest thing is to just say, okay, here's a certain amount of money, or we'll pay you basically to move out by the end of the month. Give us the keys and you're gone, and we write up an agreement that says that you will vacate, and that by fulfilling this obligation, by me paying you, you're not responsible for the rest of the lease. And it may be costly, but it could be the best process. It still might be cheaper than an eviction. And again, payment plans or other plans, they're behind by a month or two, you'll take a portion of that every couple of weeks, or every month you'll take a little bit more than what their normal rent is, and eventually they'll get caught up. So again, something that's clearly documented and can be agreed upon.
And then is enforced
Exactly.
once it's in place, because if you bend and then you have to bend again, pretty soon you're off down the slippery slope. So compassion and being reasonable while holding boundaries. So, okay. So one thing that terrifies landlords, I know, is the amount of time that can elapse while this process goes on. And it's a good reason to avoid evictions if at all possible, is because it can take 1 to 3 months if executed precisely and accurately, and there are no hiccups. And local laws are different about all these notice periods and that type of thing, so it'll vary, but it can take 1 to 3 months to get all the way through those steps that we outlined above. And just run through those real quickly with a quick timeline. Sending a notice to comply can be as short as a day or two if you're right on top of it. If you don't let it go to 2 or 3 days or more beyond the due date to send that. Filing for a summons and complaint, initiating the complaint with the court. I know courts around here are very backed up. This can take days to weeks. A tenant reply window, like I said, I think here it's in Seattle, it's about a month, but I'd expect it to be at least a couple of weeks in most places. Court hearing and issuance of a judgment. Court schedules are, subjective, different areas, but days to weeks. Issuance of the writ of restitution, that could be on the spot at the hearing, or it could take a couple of days or more. And the move out period set by the court. So the court will generally give the tenant some time, generally not a long period of time, probably a few days, to actually act on the writ of restitution and move out. And then if they don't do that voluntarily, then it can take days to weeks to get the sheriff scheduled to go out and exercise the writ of restitution, removing people from the property. So it can easily add up to a couple months.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are reasons why you might want to hire a lawyer. Timing is one of those things. And we know, we've heard stories of people who are able to do it themselves, people have done it themselves, and it's definitely possible. And I think a lot of it also depends on where you might be location-wise. But the reasons why you might want to hire a lawyer. So give yourself the best chance of successfully evicting the tenant in the shortest amount of time possible. They're going to know the steps, they're going to know the process, they're going to keep the ball rolling They're not going to have any things that they got to go look up. They're not going to misstep and have to start the process over. They're going to know the laws in detail. So make sure you have the grounds to evict. They're going to make sure you put together a strong case, that you manage the courts and agencies efficiently, and timing is right. And they're going to make sure you get all the compensation possible as far as past rent, coverage of legal fees and court costs, reimbursement for damages and repairs and things like that. And then they're going to know all the rules, right? They're going to know in some places, depending on where your property is, maybe there are a couple extra steps that we haven't talked about here. Or there's certain timing, like in Seattle, you can't evict during the winter. So certain things like that, they'll make sure that you're following those rules and you're abiding by the rules. Or not, either best case, you start all over. Worst case, you rack up some fines or things like that.
Yeah, and it hadn't occurred to me until just, when we were talking earlier, but even if you get a lawyer involved and you don't go all the way through the eviction process, having somebody who can write an effective payment plan or agreement to resolve issues, or a cash for keys document that will be binding is valuable. And again, RHA, Rental Housing Association, sometimes have those forms. Like I think maybe ours has a cash for keys form even, but you don't always have just the right form for the situation. And a lawyer can help you draft something that's consequential, that accomplishes what you want. So, okay, so just to recap, our takeaway here on evictions is avoid them at all costs. Screen your applicants carefully. It's of paramount importance that you have good tenants, because it will cost you. If you have to go through an eviction, you're not going to be happy about it. Pay attention on an ongoing basis to what's going on your property, so that you see dangerous situations. You see if somebody's got an animal that they're not supposed to. You see the state of things going downhill. Be present often enough. We talk lots about doing inspections every 6 months to a year or so, but just generally going to the property on at least a monthly basis, I think, is a good idea. Enforce your lease terms consistently so that you don't let things start to slide. Issue those notices if there is a problem promptly, so that the ball starts moving and you're not pushing out the overall lapse time of an eviction if you do have to go that route. Study up on local laws and eviction processes, even if you're not in a situation, so that you know what you're supposed to do leading up to it is good practice. Just know what the laws are. And lastly, we are not lawyers, and nothing we've said today should be construed as legal advice. Often it's a good idea to hire a local real estate lawyer who knows the laws. Paying lawyers is never fun, but it can be a lot better than the alternative. So that's what we've got for you today on evictions. We hope that this has been valuable for you, and that you will like this, share it, subscribe to our channel, and come back and see us next time. Our next episode coming up is on the move out process, when a tenancy is coming to a close, and the steps for how they move and how it gets cleaned and ready, and deposits and all that type of thing. So thanks for watching.